In the winter of 1946, an American naval armada set sail, not toward Europe, not toward the Pacific, but to the most remote and lifeless continent on Earth. Over 4,000 men, 13 warships, and 30 aircraft were dispatched to Antarctica in what remains the largest military expedition the frozen continent has ever seen. The mission lasted only a few months before it was cut short. Officially, it was about science and training, but unofficially, that's where the story starts to unravel. The world had just emerged from the deadliest war in history, and a new conflict, the Cold War, was already beginning to cast its shadow. Antarctica, to most, was nothing more than a frozen wasteland, but to strategists, explorers, and perhaps even secret planners, it was something far more valuable, a blank space on the map that might hide more than just ice. Whoever controlled the poles could, in theory, control global air routes and secure a strategic advantage in long-range warfare. To lead the expedition, the U.S. Navy turned to Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd. He wasn't just another officer. Byrd was an American icon, a decorated war hero, a pioneer of polar aviation, and a man who had already etched his name into history through daring expeditions to both poles. To the public, he embodied the spirit of exploration. To the military, he was the perfect commander for such an ambitious undertaking. On paper, the operation was called the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, 1946-47. But it's the code name that stuck: Operation Highjump. The stated objective seemed straightforward enough: train military personnel in extreme conditions, test new equipment, establish a permanent base called Little America 4, and collect scientific data. Yet the sheer scale of the mission raised questions even at the time. For what was described as a research project, the fleet looked alarmingly like a military invasion. That's when the doubts started creeping into the minds of the skeptics. Even before the expedition returned, rumors circulated about what the Navy had really been searching for. Some claimed it was about resources. Others thought it was about testing weapons in a hostile environment. And a few believed something even stranger: that Admiral Byrd's fleet had gone south not just to chart the ice, but to confront whatever might be hidden beneath it. Operation Highjump officially began in December of 1946, and the sheer scale of the undertaking immediately set it apart. The fleet that sailed south was no modest expedition of scientists and explorers. It was a naval task force. At its heart was the USS Philippine Sea, an Essex-class aircraft carrier that had seen action in the Pacific War. Alongside it were destroyers, tankers, supply ships, a submarine, and even icebreakers designed to carve a path through the frozen seas. In total, 13 ships. On board were more than 4,000 men. Many were seasoned veterans of World War II, carrying the weight of their experience into this strange, new mission. Others were younger, barely tested recruits, suddenly shipped off to one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They were joined by a contingent of scientists, engineers, and pilots, specialists who would document, survey, and push the limits of human endurance in a land that cared little for human survival. Officially, the mission's objectives sounded straightforward: train military personnel in cold weather operations, test vehicles, ships, and aircraft in extreme conditions, establish a permanent research station, Little America 4, to ensure a continuing American presence on the continent. And, of course, conduct scientific studies from weather observation to glaciology. But the overwhelming force dispatched south suggested this was far more than a simple research project. After all, few scientific missions required aircraft carriers and destroyers. The Navy's public framing called it an exercise in preparation, an opportunity to make sure that if war ever reached the polar regions, the United States would be ready. Yet even at the time, some observers wondered, was this truly just about training? Or was the United States simply flexing its military muscle on the last untouched frontier of the planet? When the fleet finally reached the Antarctic coast, the operation divided into smaller groups, each with its own objectives. Reconnaissance squadrons launched daily flights, their aircraft braving winds strong enough to tear wings apart. They mapped coastlines that had never been photographed, charting mountain ranges that few had ever seen. Over 70,000 aerial photographs would eventually be taken, producing one of the most comprehensive surveys of Antarctica up to that point. On the Ross Ice Shelf, supply vessels unloaded prefabricated buildings, fuel, and heavy machinery. Crews labored in sub-zero conditions to construct Little America 4, a sprawling base that served as the hub for the operation. Snow tractors hauled equipment across terrain where the line between ground and void was often invisible. Ice could crack without warning, swallowing men and machines whole. Conditions were brutal. Whiteout blizzards turned the horizon into a featureless void, disorienting pilots and stranding ground crews. Aircraft skidded on rough, improvised runways, sometimes colliding with the ice itself. Several planes were lost in crashes. Some crewmen never came home. Official reports listed at least 3 deaths, chalked up to accidents, yet even those felt unsettling in a mission that seemed so heavily resourced and carefully planned. Still, the Navy pressed forward. Tanks designed for snow struggled against the continent's shifting terrain. Tracked vehicles froze in place. Men rotated through grueling shifts, battling exhaustion, frostbite, and constant equipment failures. Antarctica was a proving ground for both machine and man, and it was winning. For all its setbacks, the expedition did achieve remarkable feats. Thousands of square miles of previously unknown land were photographed. New logistical techniques for operating in polar conditions were tested. And for a time, America had established a foothold in one of the most desolate places on Earth. By March 1947, just a few months after it began, the mission abruptly ended. The Navy announced that worsening weather, unexpected logistical problems, and growing dangers to the men forced an early withdrawal. The ships turned north, the aircraft were recalled, and Little America 4 was abandoned. The operation was declared a success, albeit a costly one. Yet to many, the sudden termination didn't make sense. This had been a mission planned for 6 to 8 months. Supplies were adequate. Manpower was strong. Admiral Byrd himself had endured worse conditions in his earlier solo expeditions. So why the retreat? Admiral Richard Byrd's own words only deepened the mystery. Stopping in Chile after the withdrawal, he gave an interview to the newspaper El Mercurio. In it, he warned that the United States must prepare for the possibility of enemy aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. The comment was startling. At a time when jet technology was still in its infancy, such a warning sounded almost impossible. To military analysts, Byrd's statement could have been a veiled reference to Soviet ambitions, an acknowledgement that long-range bombers might soon pose a threat from the polar regions. But to others, it was evidence that Byrd had encountered something else entirely in Antarctica, something he couldn't explain in plain language. And so, the official story of Operation Highjump was left with gaping holes. On paper, Operation Highjump was a bold exercise in training, mapping, and survival. But beneath the surface, its sudden end, the scale of its force, and Admiral Byrd's cryptic statements hinted that this was no ordinary scientific expedition. When the Navy wrapped up Operation Highjump, it filed its reports, photographs, and flight logs, official records that, at first glance, framed the mission as nothing more than a difficult but successful exercise. Over 70,000 aerial photographs were archived. Summaries were published in scientific journals. On paper, it was neat, tidy, and unremarkable. But once researchers and historians began digging into the details, cracks appeared. Let's take a look at some of the evidence commonly cited by skeptics. The early termination. The mission was supposed to last 8 months. Instead, it was wrapped up after barely 8 weeks. Officially, the Navy cited logistical challenges, severe weather, and the tragic loss of 3 servicemen as reasons for cutting it short. The operation had been outfitted with one of the largest fleets since World War II. 13 ships, aircraft carriers, icebreakers, destroyers, and over 4,700 men. This was not a crew that would be spooked by a few storms. Also, Admiral Byrd had endured far worse conditions in earlier expeditions with far fewer resources, which we'll discuss later. And the fleet's supply chains were still strong. Why withdraw so suddenly at such immense cost, unless something unexpected had happened? Conspiracy researchers argue the losses were greater than admitted, and that something had happened in Antarctica that the US military wasn't ready to explain. The fact that after-action reports remained incomplete and classified for years only deepens suspicion. Byrd's strange statement. In March 1947, after Highjump, Admiral Byrd returned through Chile. As we mentioned earlier, in an interview with El Mercurio, he made a statement that raised eyebrows around the world. He warned that America should prepare to defend itself from enemies that could strike the United States at incredible speeds, aircraft capable of traveling from pole to pole. At the time, this made no sense. The Soviets didn't have long-range bombers. Jets were still in their early stages. What could possibly fly from the South Pole to the North Pole at such velocity? The US never clarified Byrd's words, and soon after, Byrd stopped speaking publicly about the mission altogether. Classified files and missing reports. Much of the operation's documentation never saw the light of day. Photographs taken during the mission reportedly numbered in the tens of thousands, yet many were never released, and sections of official reports remain heavily redacted even today. When pressed through Freedom of Information requests, agencies cited national security as the reason. But that excuse makes little sense if the photos were truly just of ice, snow, and empty landscapes. What could possibly be in those missing reels that threatened US security so badly that they had to be locked away? UFO sightings from the crew. Whispers from sailors and airmen decades later painted a much stranger picture. Several claimed they witnessed disc-shaped craft appearing suddenly over the ice, or even emerging from beneath the water. In some accounts, these objects flew circles around US aircraft before vanishing just as quickly. Official logs do show that multiple planes were lost during the operation, attributed to weather or accidents, but believers argue these were sanitized explanations, that in reality, the fleet had been tested, even attacked, by something unknown. Some fringe researchers even cite declassified memos referencing unidentified aerial phenomena in polar regions, although these remain contested. the diary. Then there's the most controversial piece, the so-called Lost Diary of Admiral Byrd. Surfacing decades later in the 1990s, it describes a lush, hidden world beneath Antarctica. Byrd writes of meeting advanced beings, being warned of humanity's destructive path, and flying over forests where ice should be. Mainstream historians dismiss it as a hoax, pointing out the lack of provenance. But handwriting analysis and stylistic quirks suggest it could be authentic. Even if it's not, the timing of its sudden appearance matches the pattern of other missing or found documents tied to Highjump. Things that only see daylight long after the fact, when verification becomes impossible. Unusual military interest post-Highjump. If Highjump was truly just a training run, then why did the US suddenly return to Antarctica a few years later with Operation Deep Freeze? This time building permanent bases and investing millions during the Cold War. Supporters of the conspiracy argue that the US had learned something in 1947, something that forced them to maintain a permanent foothold in the frozen continent. And it wasn't just the US. Other nations, too, began rushing to stake their claims in Antarctica during the 1950s. Was this a race for resources or a quiet scramble to control something far stranger? By themselves, each of these details could be explained away, but together, they form a chain of unanswered questions. Why did the mission end early? Why did Byrd warn of pole-to-pole aircraft? Why are the photos missing? Why the secrecy? The official story says one thing, but the cracks in the story says another. But is it all true? The story of Operation Highjump is a magnet for mystery, a fleet withdrawn early, a celebrated admiral making cryptic statements, missing photos, strange testimonies, and the sudden return of US forces to Antarctica less than a decade later. But are these really signs of something extraordinary? Or are we simply seeing shadows where there are none? To understand, we have to examine the cracks not through the eyes of conspiracy, but through the lens of history. The operation was planned for 8 months. It lasted 2. On the surface, this feels like an enormous red flag. Why mobilize 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft, only to leave after 8 weeks? Skeptics point out something crucial. Antarctica doesn't run on human calendars. The continent has its own clock, dictated by the brutal shift between summer and winter. Highjump launched in January, already late in the season. By February, the austral winter was closing in. Winds howled at hurricane speeds. Blizzards wiped out visibility for days. And in those conditions, every accident became fatal. One such accident, the crash of the seaplane George I, killed 3 men outright. For the Navy, that was enough. Objectives had been met, bases established, aerial photographs collected, equipment tested. The withdrawal wasn't a cover-up. It was simple survival. Admiral Byrd's warning, published in a Chilean newspaper, remains one of the strangest echoes of the mission. To believers, this was evidence of something unearthly. To skeptics, it was something else entirely. In 1947, the US military was haunted by the possibility of Soviet bombers taking polar routes to strike the American mainland. Byrd wasn't confessing to UFOs. He was warning about geopolitics. A statement lost in translation became a prophecy of alien craft only decades later. 70,000 images, thousands of pages of reports. Yet only fragments trickled into the public record. What happened to the rest? The answer is both mundane and frustrating. Most of it still exists, buried in the National Archives or scattered across naval collections. Some frames are degraded, others remain boxed away, never digitized. And yes, some were redacted, but not because they revealed alien ruins. The US military classified anything that could reveal mapping data, navigation systems, or Cold War infrastructure. Secrets, yes, but earthly ones. The most sensational claims, sailors recalling disks rising from the ocean, pilots reporting luminous craft, are not found in any official log. They appeared decades later in interviews colored by memory, rumor, and pop culture UFO mania. Historians point to something simpler. Antarctica is a hall of mirrors. Light bends across ice sheets, creating mirages. The sun forms halos, false suns, and arcs that can trick even trained pilots. Combine that with exhaustion, frostbite, and whiteout conditions, and a strange sight in the sky doesn't need to be extraterrestrial. It only needs to be Antarctica. No single artifact fuels conspiracy more than Byrd's so-called secret diary. In it, he describes hidden valleys, green forests, and beings from within the Earth. But there's a problem. Byrd's actual expedition journals are preserved in the archives of the Byrd Polar Research Center, and the secret diary isn't among them. It surfaced decades later with no provenance, and scholars dismiss it as a forgery. Closer to allegory than logbook. The idea of Byrd penning mystical warnings in a hidden journal is compelling. But skeptics remind us that compelling is not the same as true. Finally, the question of why the US came back in force during the 1950s. If Highjump was just a training run, why pour millions into Operation Deep Freeze, building permanent bases on the ice? Here again, skeptics point to history, not mystery. The International Geophysical Year of 1957 was the largest scientific collaboration in human history. 40 nations turned the planet into a laboratory, and Antarctica was the crown jewel. The Navy's role was simple: provide the logistics for science. Permanent bases weren't evidence of something hidden. They were evidence of the Cold War, where presence equaled power. Taken together, the counter-arguments don't erase the strangeness of Highjump, but they do paint a picture where mystery gives way to context. To skeptics, Operation Highjump wasn't a battle with the unknown. It was exactly what the Navy said it was: training, testing, survival. A dangerous mission in the most hostile place on Earth, mythologized by those who wanted to see more than snow and ice. For every official report and skeptical counterpoint, there is another story, a shadow narrative that runs parallel to history. Operation Highjump has become a lightning rod for speculation, drawing in everything from Cold War paranoia to myths of Atlantis. Some interpretations are plausible, others are outrageous, but together they form the mythos that keeps this expedition alive more than 70 years later. The Cold War interpretation. At first glance, the Cold War reading is the most grounded. When Highjump launched in 1946, the Second World War had ended only months earlier. The United States was adjusting to its role as a global superpower, and the Soviet Union had become its rival. The atomic bomb had redrawn the rules of conflict, and every new front was seen through the lens of potential war. In this context, Antarctica was not just a frozen desert, it was unclaimed territory with potential strategic value. Polar routes could give aircraft, and eventually missiles, a direct line to any point on Earth. If the Soviets ever established bases on the ice, it could bring them dangerously close to American shores. Seen this way, Highjump wasn't about Nazis, UFOs, or lost civilizations. It was about testing the US Navy's ability to operate in the harshest environment on the planet. The tanks that froze solid, the planes that crashed in whiteouts, the crews pushed to their limits. These weren't signs of combat with something unknown. They were lessons, costly but necessary, in what it would take to fight in a new polar theater. The Nazi stronghold theory. But some argue the Cold War explanation is too neat. Instead, they point back to a more sinister history. In 1938, Nazi Germany launched an expedition to Antarctica, claiming a region they called Neuschwabenland. Officially, it was about whaling rights, but rumors spread almost immediately that the Germans were scouting territory for underground bases. After the war, stories emerged of U-boats fleeing south, carrying cargo, scientists, and even high-ranking Nazis. Two submarines, U-530 and U-977, famously surrendered in Argentina months after Germany's surrender, fueling claims that they had first delivered something or someone to Antarctica. According to this theory, Operation Highjump was not a training mission, but a military strike. The United States sent an armada south not to build bases, but to root out remnants of the Third Reich. Proponents argue the Navy encountered advanced technology, perhaps even prototypes of Nazi flying discs, rumored in German archives as the Haunebu or Vril craft. Losses sustained in combat, they say, forced Byrd's sudden retreat. Mainstream historians dismiss this outright. No evidence of Nazi fortresses has ever been found. But in conspiracy circles, the idea of Antarctica as Hitler's last refuge remains one of the most enduring legends tied to Highjump. The Hollow Earth Theory. Of all the explanations tied to Operation Highjump, none is more sensational or more enduring than the Hollow Earth Theory. Supporters point out that Admiral Byrd was no stranger to Antarctica. In fact, he had been exploring the continent for nearly 2 decades before Highjump. In 1928, on his first Antarctic expedition, he established the base Little America and famously became the first man to fly over the South Pole. He returned in the 1930s, this time spending months in near-death isolation at a remote weather station, an ordeal that only heightened his reputation as America's most hardened polar explorer. By the time of the U.S. Antarctic Service expedition, 1939-41, Byrd was no longer just a private adventurer. He was the face of America's Antarctic ambitions, establishing bases and staking quiet territorial claims, even as World War II loomed. Again and again, he mapped uncharted valleys, mountain ranges, and ice-free pockets of land that defied the public's imagination. And while the Hollow Earth theory existed without Byrd's expeditions, they are some of the most compelling arguments behind it. In some of Byrd's interviews and later writings, he referred to lands beyond the pole, phrasing that has been seized on ever since. Mainstream historians chalk it up to poetic language, but to Hollow Earth theorists, it was a slip of truth, a hint that Byrd had glimpsed something more than ice and snow. Decades later, the so-called secret diary attributed to Byrd surfaced. As the story goes, Byrd's routine survey flight took a surreal turn when his instruments began to fail. The plane shuddered, but instead of plunging into the ice, it felt as though an unseen force had seized control. He later described it as being caught in a magnetic grip, his controls useless in his own hands. Moments later, sleek, disc-shaped craft appeared on either side of him, escorting his plane through jagged peaks into a valley that by all rights should not have existed. Below stretched vast green fields, forests, and rivers glittering under an inner sun, an oasis hidden beneath Antarctica's ice. There, Byrd claimed he was guided to meet tall, radiant beings who spoke to him without words, using telepathy, warning humanity that its obsession with war and nuclear destruction would destroy the surface world if it did not change its path. Scholars dismiss the text as a forgery, but believers argue it aligns with Byrd's history of discovering the unexpected and explains his cryptic comments after Highjump. The Hollow Earth theory suggests that Highjump wasn't a training mission at all, but an attempt to locate or penetrate these hidden realms. The deaths and the sudden retreat in this telling were not caused by weather. They were the result of a warning, an unmistakable demonstration from a civilization beneath the ice, reminding humanity to stay out. It's one of the most dramatic explanations for Operation Highjump, and it has outgrown the expedition itself. The Hollow Earth myth has spawned books, cult followings, and entire documentaries of its own. In fact, it could easily stand as its own episode, a sprawling legend connecting Antarctica, Admiral Byrd, and the idea that our world is far stranger and far less solid than we've been led to believe. Atlantis under the ice. Others reach further back in time. Could Antarctica itself be Atlantis? The idea comes largely from Charles Hapgood's theory of crustal displacement. He argued that Earth's crust could shift suddenly, moving entire continents. If true, Antarctica may once have been located in a temperate zone, home to a flourishing civilization that was buried when the landmass shifted to the South Pole. Some believe Operation Highjump was less about military readiness and more about searching for these ruins. Later, satellite photos showing pyramid-like peaks in Antarctica gave the theory new life. Was Byrd's fleet sent south to investigate the tomb of an ancient, advanced civilization? If so, what did they find beneath the ice? And why has the world never been told? The resources. Even without aliens or Atlantis, Antarctica's allure is undeniable. Beneath its ice lie vast deposits of coal, oil, and possibly uranium, resources of immense strategic value in the nuclear age. Some argue that Highjump was reconnaissance, surveying just how rich the continent might be. If valuable discoveries were made, they would have been classified instantly. A sudden withdrawal would make sense if the Navy decided that the less said about these findings, the better. By 1959, the Antarctic Treaty froze territorial claims, but by then, whatever Highjump uncovered would already have been locked away. It may not have been UFOs, Nazis, or Atlantis, but perhaps it was something equally unsettling. Something that required silence, withdrawal, and secrecy. A discovery that, if ever brought to light, would force us to reconsider everything we think we know about the most remote continent on Earth. Operation Highjump should have been remembered as just another naval exercise. An impressive feat of logistics, a test of endurance, and nothing more. But instead, it became something else. A story that refuses to stay buried beneath the ice. The official account tells us it was a training mission cut short by harsh conditions. Yet the sheer size of the fleet, the abrupt withdrawal, the missing records, and Admiral Byrd's cryptic warning all suggest that something more was at play. For decades, those gaps in the narrative have been filled with speculation, Nazi strongholds, UFO battles, hollow Earth civilizations, even the ruins of Atlantis itself. None of these theories have been proven, but their persistence speaks to a deeper truth. People sense that the official story doesn't explain everything. Even the grounded theories, the Cold War rehearsal, the classified weapons tests, the resource surveys, don't strip away the mystery. If anything, they sharpen it. They remind us that secrecy itself can be just as powerful as myth, and that sometimes the strangest stories grow out of silence, not evidence. In the end, Operation Highjump stands at the crossroads of history and legend. Was it merely a logistical failure dressed up as science? Or was it the first glimpse of something humanity was never meant to see? That's the question I'll leave to you. What do you think really happened when Admiral Byrd led 4,000 men into the frozen unknown? Was it just another Cold War exercise? Or the closest we've ever come to uncovering a truth too dangerous to reveal?